Welcome everybody to this Directors Seminar to mark the United Nations World Environment Day tomorrow. I'm Doug Hilton, I'm Director of the Walter and Eliza Hall Institute, WEHI. For those of you in Victoria, I recognise the incredibly challenging circumstances that the current restrictions have created, and I very much appreciate you taking the time out of your day, whatever you're doing, to attend what I think is a really important seminar. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which I join you from today, and I'm here in Clifton Hill at the beautiful confluence of the Merri Creek and the Birrarung, and I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners in this part of the world who are the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and really embrace their continued connection to this absolutely beautiful place that we now call Melbourne. I'd also like to pay my respect to elders from other communities from where people are joining this virtual event. And I'd ask that wherever you are, you think for a moment about the land on which you were on and the traditional custodians of that land. I'd also like to note that for 65,000 plus years, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians have lived in a way that has been in harmony with this environment, and the changes that have occurred over the last 200 plus years of colonisation and theft of land are devastating on the land, and I can only imagine how devastating that must be for our Indigenous communities. Tomorrow is United Nations World Environment Day, as well as the launch of the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, which is a global mission to revive ecosystems across the planet. The emergence of COVID-19 is just one example of how disastrous the consequences of ecosystem loss can be on human health. It's also prompted organisations with a focus on improving health to review how they are responding to the impacts of climate change. Today's seminar was organised by WEHI's Environmental Management and Sustainability Committee, a group of WEHI staff and students committed to improving WEHI's contribution to climate change mitigation and prompting sector-wide conversations on this topic. And I want to make a real shout out to that group. They have been very much at the vanguard of WEHI's response. And as I said to Tony, from a leadership viewpoint, and I kind of include myself and the board, we are taking our first steps, and it's been great to have that group help us take those steps and in many cases hurry us along, because undoubtedly action required is urgent. On this note, I'd like to extend a very, very warm welcome and a huge thanks to Professor Tony Capon, who will be delivering the presentation this afternoon. Professor Capon is an Australian-trained physician and former director of the International Institute for Global Health at the United Nations University. He's now the current director of what I think is a wonderfully exciting institute, the Monash Sustainable Development Institute here in Melbourne, as well as a popular contributor to research, publications and conversations about the impact of climate change on human health. Tony, thank you so much. Thank you for taking time on what is a really important day to give us the benefit of your experience, and I'm really looking forward to your presentation.
Thanks ever so much, Doug, and delighted to be with you all here at WEHI today. I'm sitting on Wurundjeri country as well, a little bit further down the river from where you are, Doug. I'm in East Melbourne, and it's a great pleasure for me to be with you all today. A particular honour to give a director's seminar at WEHI, given that I did my PhD at one of your sibling institutes, the Queensland Institute of Medical Research, QIMR, in Brisbane. back in the 1980s. So I'm just going to see if have we got? Can you see some slides there,
Yep,
Doug?
looks good.
Yep. Excellent. Very good. So my topic today is famine, fire, and fever, understanding the scale and urgency of planetary health challenges. And I'd like, here we go. I'd like to begin with some images from the 2019-2020 bushfire season here in Australia. This image from Malakuta in far eastern Victoria, people sheltering on a beach. Here, an image from Sydney, shrouded in bushfire smoke for weeks. And Melbourne, indeed, our national capital, people wearing masks during these devastating fires long before we were wearing masks to protect ourselves from the pandemic. And these were the headlines around the world over that summer. It's really important that we don't forget these fires. And indeed, the fires ended with the rain, but so quickly we were confronting this global pandemic. And the third F in the title of my talk, so fire first, famine, fever, famine, if you read it, the title backwards, critically important too, but not in the headlines in our part of the world. Famine in Africa. Again, relating to drought, climate change, social change. These are just three emblematic examples of the consequences of environmental change for health. In this talk, I'd like to do 5 things. Firstly, I'd like to reflect on some relevant history. Secondly, make sure we're all on the same page in this Anthropocene epoch. Then I'd like to talk about the Rockefeller Foundation Landsat Commission on Planetary Health and key findings from that commission, and then broaden out to think ecologically about human health, and to end with, so what? What does this mean for the kind of work we do, whether it's at WeHi or whether it's with MSDI, or indeed, no matter who we are in society, there are implications. So some history. Mac Burnett, of course, from your institution. And as I was preparing to speak today, I was reflecting back on some of his writing, and indeed purchased a copy of his Boyer lectures online, and was delighted to see, I think it's on page, starts on page 32. He was really speaking in the 1960s about what we now call sustainable development, 50 or so years later. And so indeed, many of the early thought leaders in this field were microbiologists. Mac Burnett was exchanging with René Debow from the Rockefeller University in New York, and René Debow is credited with being the person that coined that term, think global, act local, which is a term widely used around the world in the context of sustainable development. So another microbiologist thinking ecologically. Microbiologists, of course, are always thinking about multiple species at once, but in everyday society, in places like Melbourne, we principally, on an everyday basis, mainly think about humans. But a key to progress in this new field, planetary health, is really to take that multi-species view. Another key person, of course, at WeHi for some time before he moved up to ANU, was Frank Fenner. And indeed, I was greatly honoured and delighted to co-host two Fenner conferences on the environment at the Australian Academy of Science in this broad realm. I did that with Tony McMichael from ANU back in the first decade of the 2000s. And you know, Frank was such a wise person and a great mentor. And importantly, Stephen Boyden, who is still writing and engaging in Canberra. Stephen Boyden, born in 1925, also a fellow of the Australian Academy of Science for his work on tuberculosis, worked very closely with Frank Fenner and others at the John Curtin School of Medical Research, and really had two careers. First as doing profoundly important work on tuberculosis, for which he was made a fellow of the Australian Academy of Science, and later a highly productive career in the emerging field of human ecology, which I'll say a bit more about later. The Anthropocene Epoch. Now, at this point in the talk, I was going to show a 3-minute film and animation. You can see a link here to Vimeo where you can look at it later. I was just having a bit of trouble with the compatibility of this Teams platform on my Mac computer. And so we're not going to be able to show that animation now, but I might just say a few words about the Anthropocene, and then if you're interested, you might like to look at what I think is quite a compelling 3 minutes at a later time. The video is called Welcome to the Anthropocene, and it was produced by the International Biosphere Program, an interdisciplinary science program based at the Swedish Academy of Science, and it was produced in the context of the Second Earth Summit in Rio back in 2012, and it was used in the opening ceremony of that important global conference. And essentially in 3 minutes, it tells the story of the big challenges we face together and leaves us with a hopeful message that we can grapple with this. As Doug said, it's critically urgent, but we certainly could do it if we tried. And so essentially, the term the Anthropocene has been coined by Earth scientists to define a new geological epoch on Earth. And Earth scientists are arguing that we're moving out of the Holocene epoch, the epoch that is considered the Goldilocks epoch, the perfect epoch for human life on Earth. We're moving into a new epoch. Indeed, we've moved into this new epoch, the Anthropocene, the epoch of humans, and we are now such a force in nature collectively, humans across the world, such a force in nature that we'll see it in the fossil record. But I'll say a bit more about these changes as I proceed through this talk. But do have a look at that short video if you get a chance. I now want to turn to the Rockefeller Foundation Landsat Commission on Planetary Health, which published its report, Safeguarding Human Health in the Anthropocene Epoch, back in 2015. I was greatly honoured to be one of the commissioners on that important piece of work. At the time, I was directing the Global Health Institute for United Nations University, as Doug mentioned. And you can see here a list of the other commissioners. It was chaired by Andy Haynes from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. But the commissioners came from a range of disciplinary backgrounds. There was economists and political scientists, and we came from all parts of the world. Importantly, as you can see on this slide, the bottom line here is that very much what we did with this commission, we produced an up-to-date literature review and some key policy recommendations, but it built on other work, including work that you might be familiar with, framed as One Health, the health of humans, animals, and the environment. Some at WEHI may well be engaging with that approach. Eco-health, another stream of effort more focused on ecosystems and human health and well-being, and of course the Brundtland Commission. Here's a picture of Dr. Gro Brundtland and the report, Our Common Future, the report of the World Commission on Environment and Development back in 1987. And it's notable that Gro Brundtland originally trained as a medical doctor in Norway before she went on to be Prime Minister of Norway, to chair this commission, and later to be the Director General of the World Health Organization. So that work, that commission, and that report, Our Common Future, introduced the term sustainable development to world leaders. And that was in the 1980s. And as I said before, Mac Burnett and others, René Dubos, Frank Fenner, Stephen Boyden, they were all grappling with this way back in the 60s, in the 70s, with the first UN conference on the environment in Stockholm, and later this profoundly important work in the 1980s. And but interesting that Gro Brundtland was a medico, so that human health and well-being as an outcome of sustainable development is really at the heart of what we're talking about today. This fellow also, Tony McMichael, was a wonderful mentor for me personally, and some of you may know, have known Tony. He was indeed the first graduate in epidemiology at Monash University back in 1972. He was working with Basil Hetzel at the time. And Tony was really considered a pioneer of this field, and the first epidemiologist in the world to closely study the health effects of climate change. And this is one example of his books. He's writing Planetary Overload, Global Environmental Change and the Health of the Human Species way back in the early 1990s. And we acknowledge his work strongly in the work of the Planetary Health Commission, which was published a year after he died. We can go back further historically, though, of course. Another example, Hippocrates in ancient Greece, more than 2,000 years ago. Hippocrates, considered the father of the medical profession. He was writing books like this on airs, waters, and places more than 2,000 years ago. So he was talking to his patients. He was thinking about how they lived, where they lived, making ecological deductions and distilling them in writing like this. So in some ways, what I'm talking about today is very much about reclaiming the foundations of medicine and health research. It's not a new idea. Which brings me to another point, and to where we started today with an acknowledgement of country. Waiora is a Maori word for well-being and healthy waters, and it was the framing for a major conference in Rotorua back in 2019 on promoting planetary health and sustainable development for all. This was the triennial conference of the International Union of Health Promotion and Education, and I was greatly honoured to be one of the keynote speakers at that conference. A particular honour because my background is Ngāi Tahu Maori and Scottish from the very south of New Zealand, although my family migrated to Australia in the 1960s and I was raised in Queensland and educated there, as I mentioned earlier. So these planetary health concepts, understanding that human health entirely depends on natural systems, that we can't be healthy unless our country is healthy. This is a foundational understanding for all Indigenous people in a spiritual context indeed, and also informs contemporary cultural practices for Indigenous people, including approaches to land management, for example, cultural burning, that we heard a lot more about during those extraordinary bushfires 1920. For those of us that have lived in Northern Australia, we're familiar with cultural burning. This is practiced much more in the north of our country than it is in the southeast at the moment. A lot to learn together, and we could be doing things differently. A few words too about population, because population numbers are central in this conversation as well. And here, UN estimates of global population. You can see from 1950 on the left here, projected through to 2030. Population in billions, the purple bars are the total world population. You can see seemingly inexorably rising through this phase of human development. And importantly, two other lines on this chart. The blue line is the number of people living in the countryside, and the red line, the number of people living in cities. When I was born in 1960 there, towards the left, you can see that at that time, 2/3 of the world's population was living in the countryside. And we've just passed the point not so long ago where for the first time ever in human history, more people now live in cities of the world. And by the time I die, perhaps here on Wurundjeri country in Melbourne, in a big city, the 2/3 of the world's people will be living in cities. So that's a major transition that many of us are part of. And as you can tell from what I just said, I was born in New Zealand. Indeed, it was on a sheep farm in the south of New Zealand, and I now live in a large city. So I've personally been part of this urban transition. But another really important thing about this chart is as we look ahead from 2020, where we are, beyond, as this opens up here, that continuing urbanisation provides an extraordinary opportunity for us to do better in the way we design, develop and manage cities around the world. But we can do better. We can live well in cities and reduce our environmental footprint. There's a lot of possibilities. So what do we find in the Landsat Commission? Importantly, by almost any measure, the human population can be considered healthier now than ever before. And here, life expectancy data from the World Bank in 2011, you can see on the left-hand side of the chart here in 1960 through to 2010, a 50-year period. And the black line in the middle of this chart, world average life expectancy, increasing from 1960 when I was born in the low 50s through in 2010 to the high 60s and now in the low 70s. Another important message on this chart, though, is that there are still gross inequities for certain parts of the world, South Central and West Asia, Africa, for example, where life expectancy is much lower than the world average. So health improving across the world, but still great inequities. In achieving these health gains, we've exploited the planet at an unprecedented rate. So here are examples of data that define the Anthropocene. If you get a chance to look at that 3-minute film, you'll see some of this data in that film. So from 1750, escalating carbon dioxide emissions. From 1850, ocean acidification. From 1750, energy use. From 1800, global deforestation. From 1900, water use. From 1961, fertilizer use. So you can see a real takeoff in most of these charts in the middle of last century, from around 1950. And for many people, that's considered the beginning of the Anthropocene. Some would say it's a bit earlier than that, but we certainly talk about this phase from 1950 onwards as the Great Acceleration. The Great Acceleration in consumption, and you can see the Great Escalation in indicators like this. So what is planetary health? Put simply, we define planetary health as the health of human civilization and the state of natural systems on which it depends. That was the short definition from the Lancet Commission. And it's worth noting that the concept of planetary health, that language, really came from Richard Horton, editor-in-chief of the Lancet. He was the one that proposed to the Rockefeller Foundation there needed to be a commission on this topic. And he really is a visionary in health, as you would know, and in global health, and he really is the founder of this field of planetary health with that language. Now, while it's a new term in academia and in policy, people have been working on this from the natural and social science perspectives for quite a while. One example, I'll point to the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment back in 2005, convened when Kofi Annan was leading the UN. And the schema representing the links between environmental change and human health outcomes. So you can see on the left-hand side of this figure, escalating human pressures on the global environment. In the middle, environmental changes and ecosystem impairments. And we can look at climate change, we can look at stratospheric ozone depletion, forest clearance, land degradation, wetlands loss and damage, biodiversity loss, freshwater depletion and contamination, urbanization and its myriad effects, damage to coastal reefs and ecosystems. So these are all examples of environmental changes and ecosystem impairments. And then on the right, categories of health effects. Direct health effects at the top, the most straightforward and readily understandable. The health effects of floods, heat waves, water shortages, landslides, exposure to ultraviolet radiation, exposure to pollutants, bushfires, of course. This is very clear and relatively well understood. In the middle, though, is an important category of health effects that we call ecosystem-mediated health effects. And this includes things like altered infectious disease risk, reduced food yields, undernutrition stunting, depletion of natural medicines, mental health challenges in this context. And we'll come back later to talk a little bit more about spillover of new infectious agents. And then down the bottom here, really a broad category that may be defined as indirect, deferred, displaced health effects. And here we think about the diverse health consequences of livelihood loss, population displacement, conflict, and inappropriate responses to these things. So this is quite a useful schema for keeping in your head the potential myriad consequences of these changes. And just a few slides with key findings from the Commission. Effects of multiple environmental changes on food availability and quality. So yes, we must consider climate change, temperature, extreme events, carbon dioxide, fertilization, pests, molds and fungi, and what that means for the future of food. But we must also at the same time consider other environmental changes, land degradation and soil erosion, water scarcity, loss of pollinators, overfishing, ocean acidification. Estimates of air pollution, deaths here. Air pollution, a huge health issue, as you'd be well aware. Annually, deaths from ambient particulate pollution, more than 3 million lives shortened per annum around the world. At the household level, from the burning of solid fuels for heating and cooking, for example, sometimes unflued heating and cooking, more than 4 million deaths per annum, many of them women, perhaps responsible for cooking. So in total, globally, every year, more than 7 million deaths from air pollution per annum. Really important we keep in mind the scale of some of these challenges as we think this through. And here, another issue around smoke and air pollution and health. Annual average global mortality for this 10-year period due to landscape fire smoke. And you can see here a map of the world with Southeast Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa lighting up. In Southeast Asia, this is sometimes referred to as the haze, which is really a bit of a soft euphemism for this pollution from forest fire smoke. Sometimes these fires arise as a cheap way of clearing land for the production of palm oil, for example, or indeed increasingly for the raising of beef in Indonesia and elsewhere. So land use change in the context of rising incomes, demand for animal protein with flow-on human health consequences, thousands of premature deaths, as you can see here from the key on the left-hand side of this schema. And then emerging infectious diseases. We're grappling with this global pandemic at the moment, but it's just one of many. H5N1 and SARS in our region in recent years, Ebola in West Africa, Zika in the Americas. This spillover of novel infectious agents, viruses, often from animals to people, occurs in the context of environmental and social change, whether it's forest loss, urbanization, climate change itself, new opportunities for contact between wild animals, domestic animals, and people, changes to our agri-food systems, our broader food production systems, is part of this story of the emergence of new infections. It's important to remember, though, that there's a lot that we can do about this. This is just not a tale of woe, and we used about half of the 50 pages in the Lancet to focus on meeting the challenges. We can do it, and indeed we should be doing it already, because we know much of what needs to be happen. We need to get on with it. So in my field, with a strong focus on the future of cities and how we can do better, more healthy, more sustainable cities, there's a range of things that are already possible, that are already happening in various parts of the world, including here in Melbourne. Active travel, public transport, reducing fine particulate air pollution, green spaces, bringing biodiversity into the cities, reducing the urban heat island, also having mental health benefits, watershed conservation, access to healthy food, increasing resilience to floods, storms and other extreme events. Then from the food point of view, the food and agricultural point of view, here total global cereal production from 1961 and then projected into the future in terms of need in the context of increasing direct human consumption, but also increasing consumption by animals. Such as cattle and others. So multiple approaches to meeting these increased food requirements around the world: sustainable intensification, efficient use of water and fertilizer, sustainable aquaculture, support for subsistence farmers, new sources of nutrition and diversification, biofortification, changes of diets and redirecting land use back to food, reducing food waste, importantly. So in this slide, you can see that nearly 30% of the world's total agricultural land is currently being used to produce food that's never eaten. So we're already producing a lot more food than we end up eating, whether it's food that spoils before it gets to the table, which may be the case in low-income contexts, for example, from vermin or lack of refrigeration, for example, or whether it's thrown out directly from the table, which is perhaps more likely in a country like Australia, where sometimes we present too much food for a meal and end up throwing it away. Indeed, sometimes we even throw it directly from the fridge without it getting to the table. So we might buy it in the supermarket, put it in the fridge, and then at the end of the week find those leafy green vegetables don't look particularly appetizing. So food waste is a huge issue, but it's also an opportunity. And also related to food, we can reduce greenhouse gas emissions and land use requirements from healthier diets. So plant-rich diets, better for our own health and well-being, and better for the health of the planet. This is one very evident example of co-benefits for health. And then forest conservation, reducing disease risks. Some examples from the Brazilian Amazon: malaria transmission. I know it's one area of great interest at WEHI. Fewer vector breeding sites, larger vector predator populations, greater diversity of mammalian species, microclimates inhibiting the Anopheline mosquitoes. Also for respiratory infections, the forest filtering the particulates in the air, fewer fires, lower smoke emissions, reduced collection and burning of biomass fuel, forests also reducing flooding and filtering surface water, helping to clean it up. And then modern family planning, increasing access to family planning, back to population, where I started. More than 200 million women who want to avoid pregnancy are not currently using effective contraception around the world. And access to family planning could cut maternal deaths by around 30%. And indeed, meeting these needs for modern contraception in low-income countries would only cost about $5 billion per annum, which is not a large number when we're talking about global development budgets. But clearly, there are political barriers and there are potentially religious barriers in some contexts, but it's a planetary health issue as well. And then we need to draw the lens back further and think about our wider economy and the need to urgently transition from our high consumption, wasteful economy to an economy that focuses on repair, reuse, recycling. And perhaps we don't even talk about waste anymore. We just understand that these are resources and that we need to value the resources and understand that the byproduct of one process can be an input to another process. So circularity in our thinking, more ecological thinking in the way we think about our economy. So in summary, our messages from the Commission were that solutions lie within reach but require a redefinition of prosperity to focus on quality of life and improved health for all, together with respect for the integrity of natural systems. Now, we face three broad categories of challenges that we laid out in the Commission. The first we might call conceptual challenges. If you like, these are failures of imagination. Our failure to imagine and identify genuine measures of progress. Mostly in countries like Australia, we track GDP. And if it goes up from year to year, we pat ourselves on the back and we keep moving on. But we need to make sure that when we're thinking about progress, we're also thinking about human health and well-being. We're thinking about the state of the environment. So genuine progress measures, critical, otherwise we're off track. Governance challenges. We might call these phases of implementation. And here I would point to the need for some focus on the future, for us not just to be concerned about people we can see in the world now, the people who are currently alive, and perhaps the children about to be born from pregnant mothers, which is what we tend to do in my profession of medicine and in health research. We have to lift our sights up and think about future generations. Indigenous people think 7 generations ahead. They see it as part of their responsibility. We need to bring this into everyday decision making. And indeed, there are examples of this, including the nation of Wales in the United Kingdom that enacted a wellbeing of future generations legislation back in 2015 with the Sustainable Development Goals. And they now have a commissioner for future generations. Very interesting development and something we should definitely be considering here in Victoria and Australia. And then research and information challenges. We might call these failures of knowledge. And here we argue for investment in what we might call transdisciplinary research, because we're very good at doing research within our disciplinary areas, but we struggle bringing perspectives together across academic disciplines, which we might call interdisciplinary research. But we particularly struggle with transdisciplinary research, where we're transcending academic disciplines and valuing the know-how of people in policy, in practice, of Indigenous people, genuinely an openness to different ways of knowing about the world. It's critical because sometimes science and technology is actually part of the problem in various contexts. So we really need to have open minds to different ways of understanding, thinking, and doing. So here's a link to the Landsat Planetary Health Commission. You can download that 50-page report, but there's also shorter things there. There's videos, there's infographics. It's worth a look if you haven't had a chance to look thus far. Now, I think I've got a bit more time, perhaps 10 minutes or so. I just want to broaden out a bit more to refer to the Sustainable Development Goals. When I was on the Landsat Commission, a number of the other commissioners and I were also working closely across the UN to help shape the global goals, the UN Sustainable Development Goals. As I mentioned before, I have a particular interest in sustainable and healthy cities, and so I was part of the campaign for SDG 11, Sustainable Cities and Communities. But while SDG 3 there in the top row, good health and well-being, is clearly about health and health outcomes, all of the other 16 goals are relevant to human health and well-being. We might consider them social, economic, and environmental determinants of health. So whether it's poverty, whether it's education, whether it's clean water and sanitation, climate, of course, all of these things are foundations of human health and well-being. And indeed, the World Health Organization has reframed that infographic in this way to demonstrate that the other 16 goals are also relevant to Goal 3 and health and well-being. I think this is actually quite a useful infographic when you're thinking about those Sustainable Development Goals. UNDP, Helen Clark from New Zealand was leading UNDP when we were working on the Landsat Planetary Health Commission, and she was engaging with colleagues across the organisation, and more recently UNDP published this issue brief on planetary health, arguing, as you'll see, that planetary health is an integrative way of thinking about those 17 goals. It becomes almost the purpose, what are we striving for in achieving those goals? Funding for research, Wellcome Trust, of course, a major funder of health research, probably a number of WEHI researchers partnering in Wellcome Trust funded research. At the time of the Lancet Commission, they established a new program, Planetary Health, and over at Monash in the institute I direct, we have one of the major partnership programs called RISE, Revitalising Informal Settlements and Our Environments, led by Rebecca Brown, I think Ross Koppel, who used to be at WEHI, very active in that particular program. So welcome interested. As you may know, Julia Gillard recently took up the chair of the Wellcome Trust, and they're going through a process of reshaping their approach. Climate change will be one of 3 priorities, along with infectious diseases and mental health. So, important funding opportunities here in Australia. The NHMRC and Kelso and others recently called for proposals under this special initiative in human health and environmental change. And so we will end up in Australia with a network, a research network across the country to build capacity and really stimulate further research in this field, which has been under-researched, frankly, not just in Australia, but around the world. And then new journals. Here on the left, Nature Sustainability in 2018, on the right, Lancet Planetary Health in 2017. And I'm honoured to be on the editorial board for the Lancet Planetary Health. We're really keen to encourage people to publish, looking for this transdisciplinary research that historically could be quite difficult to publish, but there are now a range of outlets available. So let's come back as I start to wrap things up to talk a bit more about human ecology, and to come back to Stephen Boyden, who I mentioned near the beginning of this talk, and one of his books, The Biology of Civilization, Understanding Human Culture as a Force in Nature. So I would argue that in the kind of population health research that I do and many others do, that we need to bring human ecology alongside epidemiology. So human ecology as a way of understanding patterns of health alongside epidemiology as another way of understanding patterns of health. We need to bring these together in research, education, policy and practice. And the Tony McMichael was a strong advocate for this broader eco-social understanding of health. And indeed, some have characterized it as eco-epidemiology, sort of just putting the ecology with the epidemiology. Let me say a few more words about this to try and explain a bit more about what I mean. In a lot of population health research, we strive to understand the range of things that people are doing, human activities, we call that in human ecology. Some would call them human behaviors, but what those things mean for human health and well-being, whether that is understanding behavioral risk factors, for example, or indeed what are sometimes called the social determinants of health. So they're things that humans are doing, organizing ourselves, agreeing to pay taxes, to provide social safety nets, to protect health and well-being, for example. So there's a range of things that people are doing, and in epidemiology, in public health, in population health, we're getting pretty good at understanding those things. But what we sometimes overlook is that people doing things on Earth are also impacting on the Earth. They're not just impacting on themselves and other people. So there are environmental impacts from the development patterns, the development paths we choose, and these impacts affect the health of the planet. And so this is where environmental scientists, for example, do a lot of their work. And what I've been arguing for in this talk is that there are flow-on impacts from those changes to the Earth, whether it's climate change or biodiversity loss, for the health of people. And we now call these ecological determinants. There was a major report from Canada about this recently. So my thesis would be that we're not as good on the ecological here. We're not, the bit at the bottom of this triangle is not really part of the conversation in much of what we do at the moment. And the reason that I've put those arrows backwards that you could just see there is because we have to think in a system way. We have to think more integratively. We have to think about unintended consequences of things we do. And all of this work comes from the work of Stephen Boyden, as I mentioned before, and specifically this biosensitivity triangle. And you could, this slide is really just a reminder to give something a bit more specific. So in relation to the work I do, thinking about urban futures, urban policy, planning, design, development and management, how can we design, develop, manage cities like Melbourne to ensure that the way people live in those cities will be maximally beneficial for their own health and for the health of natural systems. So this is where this kind of schema can be quite useful in conceptualizing the challenges we face and what we might do about it. Here's another of Stephen's books. He wrote this one well into his 90s, and this one's available free for download from ANU Press on the website, The Bio-Narrative, The Story of Life and Hope for the Future. Just a few words about some of the other things we're trying to do at the moment here in Australia, working closely with Nick Talley, who's the editor-in-chief of the Medical Journal of Australia. He invited me to join his advisory group so that we can strengthen the content on climate change and health, environmental change and health in the journal. You may have seen the new MJA Landsat countdown process. I think we're this year, 2021, will be the fourth cycle of that. This is last year's version, Lessons from Australia's Black Summer. Colleagues, you can see on the left, from various parts of Australia contributing to this multi-institutional collaboration. Two final slides. This one is an infographic that I developed with a design colleague, Leo Robber, to explain what we mean by planetary health. So we understand it as a cultural transformation, that planetary health is about safeguarding the health and well-being of current and future generations through good stewardship of Earth's natural systems and by rethinking the way we feed, move, house, power, and care for the world. So in the middle of this infographic, you can see it's about how we manage ourselves, to leave no one behind. This is the language of the UN. It's about equity. And you can see on the top right there, Boyden's biosensitivity triangle, the things we do, health of people, health of planet. We saw that before in that schema. But the big bit in the middle is about managing ourselves, managing the things we do. It's about culture, it's about mindset, it's about values, education, what we learn about, how we regulate our behavior, and the economic systems we choose. And then for the sake of giving it some more specificity, identifying 5 big pathways: how we feed the world, how we move the world, the transport systems, for example, how we house the world, not just people in their houses and apartments, but also animals, business, buildings, how we power the world, our energy systems, and then how we care for the world, whether we're caring for people in hospitals and healthcare facilities, whether we're caring for people in aged care facilities, or whether we're caring for the earth in land care. So those 5 major examples of what we need to optimize when we're thinking about how we feed the world. We need to think not just about the health of people, but the health of the earth, similarly with those others. And the bottom line here is that our future depends on the health of our natural world. That is the bottom line message from today's talk. So what? So 5 final points. What should be different in how we do things? Certainly in our work in health and health research, we need an eco-social approach alongside biomedical approaches. It's not an alternative, it needs to be alongside. We need to recognize the ecological, economic, and social determinants of health. Fundamentally important. Secondly, we need to bring systems thinking into the way we work, indeed acknowledging the interdependence of all species on Earth, including those we cannot see, the microorganisms, the trillions of microorganisms that I need to be fellow travelers, good guy fellow travelers with me today, to be with you here today. Yes, we're putting a lot of effort into controlling this tricky virus, but we can't forget that we need microorganisms to be well, to flourish. So we need to really acknowledge interdependence. Thirdly, intergenerational health equity. We certainly are getting better at describing and responding to health inequities, but as I said before, we're not good at thinking about future generations. Fourthly, Indigenous and local knowledge, the need for this transdisciplinary approach, transcending academic disciplines and valuing the know-how of Indigenous people, people in policy, people in practice, people doing things in local communities. It's critical that we are open to different ways of knowing and understanding the world. And perhaps the 5th point, my final point in the talk, a summary point, that we need to bring planetary consciousness into everyday life and socioeconomic and commercial systems. We need to be conscious of the planet, not just conscious of people. So I'll stop there and pass back to you, Doug.
Thanks so much, Tony. I think Liz McMahon is going to ask the questions that we have received from the audience.
Thanks, Doug. Thanks, Tony. What role would you envisage for medical research institutes in investigating and promoting planetary health?
Yeah, no, I think this is a really important question, and one, Doug, I'm very keen to follow up with you when we can get together after this lockdown that we're confronting here in Melbourne, because I think that there's potentially a range of ways that medical research institutes can get involved, get engaged, do more. As I mentioned earlier, I did my PhD at QIMR in Brisbane, so I have some idea of what an institute like WEHI does, and I tried to point in some of those early slides to the fact that some of the broader founders of this field of planetary health are actually laboratory scientists, immunologists, infectious disease researchers like Mac Burnett, Frank Fenner, and others. And so there's the ecological understanding of infection and where it comes from, how we might manage it. And then there's also the operations of a big institute with a big budget, and which leads to an environmental footprint from the work of research as well. So
I think that's a really interesting question, Tony, and it is one that I look forward to exploring. It's really interesting when you look back to those days with Mac Burnett and Fenner and a whole lot of other people who were working almost in a One Health setting. Almost overnight, Burnett shut that down, sent them all to Canberra and decided we were an immunology institute. So, you know, it's an interesting part of our history through the 20s, 30s, 40s into the 50s. And I think one of the great challenges is, you know, how do organisations like WEHI that perhaps have a deep investment in, you know, basic biology, atomic level understanding of protein structures and pathways and cells, or an institute like Peter MacCallum that treats cancer, how do we make a contribution that is not dabbling, that is really meaningful and is aligned with our desire when we do something, we want to do it wholeheartedly and properly. You know, and that really was Burnett's decision in the 50s. We're not going to do virology. You know, we're not going to work on animal viruses and things like that. We are going to be an immunology institute. He had the strength of conviction to do that overnight. I'm not sure necessarily that I'd be willing to send all my structural biologists, my cancer researchers and my immunologists somewhere else and then recruit for a One Health Institute. Maybe that's what I need to do, but I'm not sure that I necessarily have Burnett's strength of conviction.
No, it's very interesting to reflect on that history. And indeed, in preparing for this talk, I spoke to Warwick Anderson, the medical historian from the University of Sydney, and he pointed out a number of those historical touch points that you've referred to, Doug. And I think one option would be for WEHI to engage in cross-institutional partnerships, like, for example, with MSDI, where I'm now the director, but also with others. CSIRO, for example, has a range of relevant interests in this space, and I know that the Burnett has interests, the Doherty. You know, there's various interests, but how would we come together? Doesn't mean that suddenly institutes have to do a complete U-turn, if you like. It's really about acknowledging this Anthropocene, that we have changed the world since the 1950s with this great acceleration. Now we must rethink how we do things. This latest pandemic, one example of a planetary health challenge. Those big bushfires, another example. The current famine in Africa, another example. You know, how should we respond? We can't just keep doing things like Mac Burnett did in the 60s because we're in the Anthropocene. We hadn't seen those changes because he was there right at the beginning of the Anthropocene.
What do you think the future of energy production at industrial scale looks like over the next 10 plus years?
Yeah, look, I mean, this is such a central question, including for us here in Australia. And Ross Garnaut, of course, eminent Australian economist, and his book Superpower really charts a vision for the future of Australia as a renewable energy superpower. This is eminently possible. Frankly, it should have already happened. Our system of government has not enabled it to happen. It seems because of undue influence by some in the fossil fuel sector, holding on to the past, if you like. And this is not a good thing for our young people, because I think even the OECD in their recent report acknowledging that we have to move on around the world from relying on coal and other fossil fuels to make energy. We've got alternatives. There's no reason why we couldn't be doing it already. For the moment, we still need coal to make steel. So until we have an option, we will still need some coal. But to be imagining that we will still be burning lots of coal in coming decades is just a nonsense. And this also brings me back to my point that I mentioned in the talk, that sometimes science and technology is part of the problem. Because when Thomas Edison built the first coal-fired power station in, I think it was 1882 in London. That was a remarkable science and technological advance for the time. What we now understand is that there were very significant unintended consequences from that once it was at scale. So in science, we always have to be questioning ourselves as well, because sometimes science and science paradigms don't provide the answers.
Okay, Tony, this is the last question, so we're not going to be able to get to all of them. The questioner says, thanks for a terrific talk. One area also identified by the World Health Organization as an area that will severely reduce life on a par with climate change is antimicrobial resistance. Many parallels with climate change in that treating patients now also affects patients years into the future. This doesn't seem to be on the radar at all in Australia. What strategies can we take to address this?
Yes, this is very relevant to, I think, WEHI and other medical research institutes in Australia. There's more work to be done, some of it through that frame of One Health, as you said, Doug, before. And one aspect of this that I am particularly interested in is how we have conversations about healthy microorganisms in society, because what we tend to do is focus on pathogens, and then we particularly focus on really bad guy pathogens like antibiotic resistant microorganisms, this particular pandemic virus, for example. But let's make sure that when we're having conversations, we're nesting them in this broader view, an ecological view of microorganisms and how we need lots of microorganisms to be well. We need those fellow travelers. So there needs to be absolutely more attention to antimicrobial resistance. We need to carefully monitor and track things inside hospitals and healthcare facilities. The use of antimicrobials in animal husbandry is also an important aspect of this. And then we need to nest that in these broader understandings. And one specific project that may be of interest, we have colleagues at the University of Adelaide working on what they call HUMI, HUMI, the Healthy Urban Microbiome Project. And this comes to acknowledging, in one of my early slides, the urban transition, the fact that many young people, my children included, were born in cities, whereas I was born in the countryside, and they haven't had the opportunities to make mud pies up near the shed up the back of the house on the farm. They're not getting their hands in the earth, perhaps, as much living in urban areas. So, how do we make sure that children in modern cities can encounter those healthy microorganisms in the parks, in the community gardens, really getting their hands in the earth as well?
Thank you so much, Tony, and thank you, Liz, for orchestrating the questions. You've been hugely generous with your time, Tony, and certainly I look forward to conversations with you in the next weeks.
Yep. Thanks very much, Doug. Thanks all. It's been terrific to be with you, and look forward to following on.
Bye.
Bye-bye.